Dinner in the suburbs of Reno began like a warm farewell, but after a single sentence, the air shattered like glass, cracking under the weight of an old memory. "I think you should stay here a little longer, Mom, in the new care unit at Desert Clinic. We've already arranged everything." Ryan spoke softly, almost tenderly, but there was something frightening about how calm his voice was. The yellow light from the chandelier cast over his face, revealing a firmness Margaret had never seen in her son before. She sat motionless, her hands trembling slightly around a cup of cold tea, whose steam had long disappeared. Outside the window, the Nevada desert lay veiled in dust and distance, vast and lifeless. She didn't answer right away. From the kitchen, Chloe, her daughter-in-law, brought out a tray of pudding, the cloying scent of vanilla filling the dining room. She smiled brightly, but the smile was as thin as porcelain, about to crack. "We just want you to be safe," Chloe said, setting the tray down. "The doctor said you need to be monitored regularly. It's dangerous to live alone." Dangerous. The word struck Margaret like an insult. She had lived 68 years, taught for more than 30, survived illness, loss, and loneliness all on her own. And now they were telling her she needed to be kept safe. Safe from whom she asked hoarsely, her eyes fixed on her son. "Or from you?" Ryan shifted in his chair, avoiding her gaze. "You're overthinking this, Mom. It's only temporary. You'll like it there. Medical staff, regular meals. I've already signed the papers." Margaret's mind went blank. "You signed I have that right, Mom. The authorization form you signed last year in case of emergency." She remembered. She had fallen that year, and Ryan had come to the hospital assuring her it was just paperwork to make it easier for him to take care of her. She had signed without reading carefully. Chloe spoke again, her voice as smooth and delicate as a thread tightening around the neck. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll handle the house. We'll store the heavy stuff so you don't have to think about it." Margaret understood. Store meant clear out, erase every trace of her from the home she had built with her own hands alongside her husband. The clock struck 8. The ticking seconds pierced through the silence. Ryan stood. "The car's almost here. I'll take you. Just a few weeks." She didn't argue. There are moments when you realize a storm cannot be avoided, only endured in stillness. Quietly, Margaret put on her old knitted sweater and clutched her small suitcase to her chest. When Ryan opened the door, the desert wind swept in, carrying the scent of dust and gasoline. On the road, lights from distant casinos glowed like open wounds across the night. She sat in the back seat, staring through the window, silent, her mind flooded with fragments of memory. Her husband's calloused hands wrapping tape around a shovel handle, the lavender garden swaying in the wind, her granddaughter Ella's laughter echoing through last summer. All of it now seemed to fade away. The car turned onto a dirt road. A dim sign appeared under the headlights, Desert Clinic Comprehensive Care and Rehabilitation for Seniors. Behind the iron gate stood a row of cold square buildings. Ryan stopped the car. "You'll be fine, Mom. I'll visit soon." She looked at her son, the boy who once held her hand when he was afraid of the dark, who once promised, "I'll protect you when I grow up." Now those same eyes could not meet hers. "Don't forget to take your medicine, okay?" She didn't answer, only nodded. A young nurse named Carla came out to greet them, her smile stiff beneath the fluorescent lights. "Welcome, Mrs. Hensley. Please sign your admission form." "I'm not signing anything," Margaret said quietly. "Your son has already completed the paperwork." "You just need to rest now," Carla replied gently, signaling 2 staff members to take the suitcase. Margaret looked around bright white hallways, numbered doors, the heavy smell of disinfectant. Everything was too clean, too quiet, a kind of quiet that made it hard to breathe. The door to her room closed behind her. The click of the lock echoed. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand brushing over the crisp, icy sheets, smooth and sterile. From the hallway came the rhythmic squeak of nurses' shoes, a sound like the heartbeat of the place. She closed her eyes, fighting the tremor in her hands. To be betrayed by the very person you gave life to, there were no words deep enough to describe that pain. Part of her wanted to scream, to pound on the door, to demand her name back. But another part, the quieter part, told her that silence might let her hear something more important, the truth. Margaret opened her eyes and looked through the small window. The Nevada sky was pitch black, with only a single lonely star. She whispered as if speaking to her late husband, "They think I'm weak, but I'm still here." In the dim light on the bedside table, her small suitcase sat slightly open. Among the few belongings inside, the corner of an old leather-bound notebook peeked out. She recognized it instantly, the missing journal her husband once kept filled with strange numbers she had never understood. Margaret gently closed the window, the desert breeze threading through her silver hair. She clutched the journal to her chest, feeling her heart begin to beat stronger. They thought they had locked her away. But that very night in the stillness of Desert Clinic, a plan was born. The first morning at Desert Clinic began with the shrill chime of a bell echoing down the hallway, cold and mechanical, like a reminder that in this place, time belonged to no one. Margaret opened her eyes, squinting against the harsh white light spilling through the small window. The sharp scent of disinfectant filled her lungs with every breath. The clock on the wall read 8 a.m., but inside that sterile room, it could have been any hour in a life that no longer belonged to her. Carla, the young nurse from the night before, entered carrying a tray of pills and a weary smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Hensley. Vitamins and supplements. You have your routine checkup at 9. Margaret sat up, holding the glass of water, but not drinking. "I want to call my son," she said. Carla hesitated. "I'm afraid that's not allowed, ma'am. You don't have external call privileges. All communication has to go through your legal guardian." Guardian, Margaret repeated slowly, her voice firm, her gaze sharp enough to make Carla take a step back. "Your son has power of attorney," the nurse explained quickly. "For now, all decisions go through him." Margaret turned away, hiding the tremor spreading through her chest. Carla's voice faded as she left the room, leaving behind the bitter smell of medicine and the cold click of the door closing. Margaret looked down at her hands that once held chalk to teach hands that had rocked her granddaughter to sleep. Now they trembled slightly, as if they no longer belonged to her. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. A gray-haired woman with clear, alert eyes peeked in. "Room 23, right, I'm Doris," from across the hall. Margaret nodded. Doris stepped in, bringing with her the faint scent of cheap soap. "New here, aren't you? Everyone is the same on their first day. They all think this is temporary." "I won't be here long," Margaret said firmly. Doris let out a dry laugh. "That's what they all say. But here, time stretches like chewing gum. There's a man down the hall who's been here 6 years and still thinks he's leaving next week." Margaret said nothing. From the hallway speaker came an announcement, "Breakfast will be served in Dining Room A in 15 minutes. Doris shrugged. Oatmeal again. The kind of food they give you just to keep you alive, not living. They both chuckled softly, their laughter edged with bitterness. Doris leaned closer and whispered, "Be careful. If you complain too much, they write it down as emotional disturbance. Then they send you to the observation ward. No one comes back from there the same." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Just call me Doris, and remember, silence is a weapon here." Breakfast took place in a wide room under fluorescent lights that made every face look ageless. People ate without speaking. The only sounds were the clinking of spoons against bowls. Margaret sat with Doris and an old man muttering endlessly about his missing son. She scanned the room. Everyone here had the same vacant stare, the look of someone left behind. On the wall hung a slogan, "Caring is our mission." Just below it, a small camera blinked red. Margaret thought to herself, caring or watching. After breakfast, another nurse escorted her to the examination room. The smell of antiseptic lingered among the hum of machines and the scratch of pens on paper. A middle-aged man with glasses, Dr. Keller, greeted her with a cold smile. "This is just a routine checkup, no need to worry. Your son has already paid for a full 6 months of care." Very thoughtful of him. Margaret stared straight at him. "And if I want to leave?" she asked. "That's not possible, Mrs. Hensley. We only release patients upon request from their guardian. For now, please cooperate." His words landed like a verdict. Margaret bit her lip to hold back tears, but beneath the sorrow, something else began to rise anger. By afternoon, the sunlight slanted through the small window, casting a golden stripe across the wooden desk. Margaret sat writing in the old leather-bound journal she had found the night before. The pages had yellowed, but her late husband's handwriting remained bold rows of numbers, strange financial notes, and in the corner a line that made her heart skip. Account 7739, name holder MH Keep, confidential code stored at Fremont Bank, California. She froze, pulse quickening. MH, her own initials, Margaret Hensley. She read it again, her lips moving faintly. Her husband David had once been a chief accountant. Before he died, he had told her only one thing: "You'll be fine. I've prepared everything." She had thought it was just comfort, but now those numbers flickered in her mind like a candle glowing in darkness. The hallway speaker crackled again, announcing the afternoon activity session. Margaret closed the journal and hid it under her pillow. At the door, Carla appeared, smiling politely. "Would you like to join the art therapy class?" "No," Margaret said softly but firmly. "I'd like to write. I need paper and a pen." Carla looked surprised, then nodded. "All right, I'll bring them." When she left, Margaret turned her gaze toward the window. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, the dunes gleaming like blades under the sun. A dry wind whistled past, carrying a sound that could almost be a warning. In that moment, Margaret understood they could confine her body within these white walls, but not her mind. She reopened the journal and pressed the pen to a fresh page. The first sentence appeared slowly, steady, and deliberate. "They think I am frail, but they've forgotten. I once taught people how to read between the lines." She paused, studying her own handwriting, then smiled. It was not the smile of resignation, but of someone who had found a crack of light inside the darkness. The desert outside might be endless, but within her a quiet plan had begun to breathe. The second night at Desert Clinic was so cold and silent that every sound echoed clearly. The footsteps of the night nurse, the low hum of the air conditioner, the wind brushing past the small windows. Margaret lay awake, unable to sleep. Moonlight slipped through the bars, falling across the journal she had hidden under her pillow. A sudden impulse made her sit up. She pushed the blanket aside and opened the notebook. The next page held her late husband, David Hensley's hurried handwriting. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Account 7739 remains under your legal ownership. The access code is written on the last page, hidden within a line of poetry." Margaret quickly turned to the final page. Between clumsy, unfinished verses, one short line stood out: "Between desert winds and violet blooms, remember December." She exhaled softly. December, the month of their wedding, and the same code David once used for their old safe. Her hands trembled. Her heartbeat quickened. For the first time in years, fear and hope shared the same breath. The next morning, the sky was pale gold and still like the surface of a quiet lake. Doris knocked on her door, holding 2 paper cups of weak coffee. "Brought you one. It's the strongest thing you'll find around here." Margaret smiled gratefully. Doris sat across from her, gently pulling the curtain to let a sliver of sunlight in. "I saw your light on all night," she said. "Couldn't sleep, I was reading the past," Margaret replied. Doris gave a dry laugh. "The past is what people here try hardest to forget. Hold on to it too long and it'll drive you mad." "No," Margaret said slowly. "It's what's keeping me awake." Doris studied her face for a moment, then shook her head. "Being awake can be dangerous here. They don't like people who think too much." Margaret nodded. "Thank you for the warning. I'll be careful." At noon, while everyone was napping, Margaret quietly stepped into the hallway. The security office door was ajar, the faint sound of an old radio drifting out. On the desk sat a landline phone, its coiled cord dangling loosely. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. She needed only 1 minute, 1 call. She dialed the number for Fremont Bank in California, a number she had memorized long ago. A woman's voice answered, calm and professional. "Good afternoon, this is Fremont Private Banking. How may I assist you?" Margaret's voice trembled but remained clear. "I'd like to check the status of account number 7739 under the name Margaret Hensley." There was a pause followed by the clicking of keys. "I'm sorry, ma'am. May I ask your relation to the account holder?" "I am the account holder," Margaret said firmly. "Please hold while I confirm," the woman replied. Margaret held her breath, more typing the rustle of papers. Then the woman's voice returned slower, this time tinged with surprise. "The account is active, ma'am. It was placed under security lock in 2008, pending verification by the owner or heir. The current balance is—" She hesitated as if doubting what she saw. $75 million. Margaret froze. The room seemed to spin. Her hand tightened around the receiver. "How much did you say 75 million, ma'am?" "The original investments have accumulated interest over 17 years. Would you like to schedule an in-person verification appointment?" Margaret swallowed hard. "I will contact you soon." She hung up, her heartbeat thundering like a drum. Cold sweat broke across her forehead. Outside, Carla's footsteps echoed down the hall. Margaret quickly slipped back into her room, closing the door before she could be seen. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she felt the weight of it all, $75 million. David had left behind a fortune, and she had never known. But the realization came with a sharper truth Ryan must have known. Otherwise, why would he rush to take her legal rights away? That afternoon, Carla came by with the medicine tray. "You look tired, Mrs. Hensley. Should I call the doctor?" Margaret smiled, hiding the tremor in her hands. "No need, just a little dizzy. Maybe the air here is different." "You'll feel better tomorrow," Carla said kindly before leaving. Alone again, Margaret watched the late sunlight fade to a soft orange glow across the wall. She opened her journal and began to write. "David, you kept your promise. But our son is no longer the child you knew. They've locked me away because they're afraid. And they're right. I won't let them rest." She closed the notebook and hid it beneath her mattress. Outside in the corridor, Doris leaned casually against the wall, her eyes glinting. "You're hiding something," she asked. "A journal," Margaret replied. "The most dangerous thing here is what people write down," Doris said, half teasing, half serious. Margaret answered softly, "Only dangerous to those who have something to hide." As night fell, she sat by the window again, gazing toward the narrow road that led to the main gate. In the distance, headlights occasionally flashed across the desert before vanishing into the darkness. She knew somehow she had to find a way out, not only to reclaim her freedom, but to take back the dignity that had been stolen from her. On the desk, the journal lay open, the ink of her final line still glistening. Day 2 at Desert Clinic. I know the secret they tried to bury, and I'm ready to dig it up. The next morning, the sun rose slowly behind the distant mountains. A pale golden light fell over the sand outside the window, making Desert Clinic look as though it were trapped inside a giant glass dome. Margaret woke early, her heart still beating to the fast rhythm of last night's phone call. $75 million. The number burned in her mind like a flame, one that both warmed and consumed her. She brewed a weak cup of tea, her hands still slightly trembling. Doris knocked on her door, holding an old newspaper. Nothing worth reading, just more bad news. Then she looked at Margaret closely. "You've got something to tell me, don't you?" Margaret smiled faintly. "It's too soon to tell Doris, but when I'm done, you might want a drink to celebrate." Doris let out a raspy laugh and sat down. "You sound like someone planning an escape." "No," Margaret replied, her gaze fixed on the window. "I'm planning to go home." After Doris left, Margaret opened her journal and wrote a few lines. Day 3. I need to find a lawyer. I can't let them take everything. David, you trusted me. I won't let you down. At lunch in the large dining hall, the clinking of spoons echoed rhythmically, hollow and lifeless. Carla moved between tables, checking each tray, pausing now and then to chat. Margaret watched her carefully. When Carla set the tray down on her table, Margaret spoke softly. "Carla, may I ask you something? Do you know anyone here who can help with legal documents? It's just a letter." Carla looked at her, hesitating. "Who do you plan to write to my lawyer? I need someone to confirm my health condition." Carla lowered her voice. "You know that's not easy. All letters are screened." Margaret leaned in, her tone gentle but steady. "I taught literature for 30 years, dear. I know how to make people read something without understanding what they've just read." Carla hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'll see what I can do." That afternoon, Margaret pretended to read in the common room. In truth, her eyes followed the man in the beige suit, speaking with the facility manager. He carried a leather briefcase, his voice low and confident, attorney Andrew Vega sent by a charity organization to provide free consultations for the elderly. She waited until he finished his conversation with a small group of residents, then approached quietly. "Mr. Vega." He looked up politely. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I need advice about a son who's gained full legal control over his mother's assets without her consent." He frowned slightly. "Do you have documentation?" "I do. And something more important, a reason." Andrew glanced around. "This isn't the best place to talk. In 15 minutes, I'll be inspecting the back garden. If you'd like, meet me there." 15 minutes later, Margaret put on her gray sweater and walked down the dry path to the abandoned garden. The so-called therapy garden was nothing more than a few dying shrubs and a rusted bench. Andrew stood waiting, hands in his coat pockets, the desert sunlight reflecting off his dark glasses. "You can speak freely." "There are no cameras here?" he said. Margaret opened her journal and handed him a note. "I found this. It belonged to my late husband. He was an accountant. It seems he left me an account, but I'm not allowed to access it." Andrew examined the paper, his expression shifting from doubt to focus. "This account is legitimate, Fremont Bank Private Division. If what you're saying is accurate, you're the sole beneficiary. But I'm being held here. My son is my guardian. I can't leave." Andrew nodded slowly, his voice lowering. "You'll need 2 things, a psychological evaluation stating that you're of sound mind and a petition to revoke his guardianship. I can help with both, but it will take time and absolute discretion." Margaret met his gaze firmly. "I've lived in silence for too long. Discretion is something I'm very good at." He smiled faintly, giving a respectful nod. We'll start with a new name. I'll register a trust under an alias to protect you." Clara West Margaret replied without hesitation. "My grandmother's name. She was a woman who never bowed to anyone." Andrew took note and spoke quietly. "If I call, just listen and say nothing. I'll use the code name Vega. When I say, 'The weather's nice today,' it means everything is safe. And if the weather's not nice, then keep your secret in silence until I return." Late in the afternoon, Margaret returned to her room. Carla was folding her blanket. "You were out a bit long today," she said lightly. "Just taking a walk," Margaret replied, calm and composed. When Carla left, Margaret opened her notebook again and wrote, "Day 4. I met the first person who believes me, Andrew Vega. We have a plan. They think they've locked me up, but no one knows I've just found the key to an old lock." Night fell, and the desert wind howled through the cracks in the window. She sat by the table, her cup of tea gone cold. In the distance, a truck's headlights swept across the horizon before fading into darkness. Margaret watched them disappear, her eyes steady with resolve. $75 million was more than money. It was proof that she still existed. Proof that her story was far from over. She closed her journal and whispered to herself, "The day they brought me here, they thought I'd stay silent. They forgot I'm the woman who taught a whole generation how to use words, and I'm about to use every single one to take everything back." 2 days later, the Nevada sky was clear as polished glass, but the dry chill made it hard to breathe. Margaret pulled her gray sweater close and stepped into the back garden. The desert stretched endlessly, the wind curling sand into small ridges, and the rusted gate creaked each time someone passed through. Andrew Vega was waiting on the stone bench, a folder resting on his knee, his demeanor calm and steady. "You're right on time," he said quietly, glancing around. "No one followed you." Margaret sat down, lowering her voice. "I can't stay long. The morning nurse does surprise rounds." "That's fine," Andrew replied. "I just need your signature here." He handed her a stack of papers. "This is a new power of attorney and a declaration of mental capacity. It confirms that you are of sound mind, not suffering from any condition that would justify someone else having authority over you." Margaret took the pen, her hand trembling slightly. She had signed hundreds of documents during her 30 years as a teacher, but this time her fingers would not stay still. Andrew placed his hand gently on the edge of the paper to steady it. "Think about what brought you here," he said softly. She pressed her lips together, took a deep breath, and signed. "Margaret Hensley." Andrew nodded. "Good. From now on, I can represent you legally." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out another paper printed with the letterhead of Fremont Private Bank. "I contacted them. They confirmed that account. 739 is valid and ready to be reactivated under the air name Clara West. I use that name for you." Margaret frowned slightly. "Meaning?" "It means you now have a new identity, Clara West. All transactions will be encrypted and untraceable. No one can connect you to the account." Margaret looked at him, a faint spark of light in her eyes. "I just want to make sure that if I die here, that money goes to Ella, my granddaughter. She'll be the sole beneficiary," Andrew assured her. "You must trust her a lot. Ella never asked for anything. She's the only one who still calls me every week, not for favors, just to tell me about school, about little things. I owe her a free future." The wind picked up a dry leaf, skittered across the ground, and landed on Andrew's folder. He closed it, his tone turning firm. "Now comes the difficult part. We have to stay quiet. If your son finds out, he'll react badly. I've looked into his records. He's already transferred ownership of your house into his name." Margaret smiled thinly, bitterly. "I suspected as much. He thinks I can't read." Andrew gave her a measured look. You'll also need evidence that you were admitted here under coercion. I can bring in an independent doctor to examine you, but we need a legitimate reason to get him inside. Margaret paused for a moment, then said, Tell them it's a nutrition assessment. I've complained about the food here a few times. They'll believe I'm just a fussy old woman. Their eyes met and a quiet understanding passed between them. Andrew smiled slightly. You're clever. Not many in your situation could stay this composed. I taught for 30 years, she replied. The best students are the ones who stay silent and observe. I'm just doing the same. They stood up. Andrew gave her a gentle handshake before leaving. I'll return in 3 days. If there's a problem, tell the nurse you need to call your daughter in Santa Barbara. That message will reach me. And if they don't let me call, then wait until night. I have other ways. Margaret walked back to her room, feeling the weight of each step. Carla was changing the sheets and smiled when she saw her. Out for a walk. You look better today. The air out there is kinder than the air in here, Margaret said softly. Carla nodded, then lowered her voice. Do you still want me to send that letter for you? I asked my supervisor it's allowed as long as the content's clear. Margaret smiled warmly. Thank you, but I've already found someone to help me. Someone. Carla frowned. You should be careful. Some of the people who come here pretending to offer help are just after money. I understand, Margaret replied, her tone as light as the desert breeze. I know what I'm doing. That evening, Doris knocked on the door with 2 packets of tea. Heard there was a stranger at the clinic today. You know anything about that? Margaret poured hot water into 2 cups, her eyes calm. A lawyer from a charity organization. They were talking about senior rights. Rights? Doris gave a dry laugh. Around here, the only right we get is silence. Margaret placed a cup in front of her. Then I'll start with silence, but I'll end with a voice. Later that night, after Doris had gone to sleep, Margaret opened her journal. Outside, the desert wind lashed against the window like ocean waves made of sand. She wrote Day 5. The wind is stronger, and so am I. Andrew said I need a new name, but I'm still Margaret, the woman they underestimated. They think I'm old, weak, and forgotten. They don't know that once a secret awakens, it never sleeps again. She put down her pen and looked around the small room. The fear was gone. Only anticipation remained. 3 days. And beyond them, a new world quietly forming like a seed buried in the sand, waiting for the rain to come. On the 6th night at Desert Clinic, light rain fell over the desert, a rare event that made everyone turn toward the windows, as if witnessing a miracle. Margaret sat at her desk, her fingers resting lightly on the cover of her journal. The rain drummed softly on the tin roof, its rhythm like the ticking of a clock, counting down. Only one more day until Andrew's return. One more day for her secret to survive. At dawn, Doris knocked gently, holding a pair of knitting needles and a ball of brown yarn. I've been up since 4. The rain kept me awake. Would you like to join me in the common room? Margaret shook her head. I need quiet to write, but you can stay if you'd like. Doris sat down and began to knit her voice low and steady. I was a nurse for 40 years. You know, I've seen all kinds of people left behind. Some cry, some go silent, but only a few are like you, their eyes still have fire. Margaret smiled. I don't believe in endings, Doris, only in chapters that were written wrong. When Doris left, Carla entered carrying a breakfast tray and a small envelope. Mail for you, she said. No return address. Margaret kept her expression calm. Thank you. I'll read it later. When the door closed, she carefully tore the envelope open. Inside was a neatly written note in Andrew's handwriting. An independent doctor will arrive this afternoon. Let him see that you're lucid. Afterward, I'll file the petition to revoke guardianship. Everything is on track. V. Margaret folded the letter and hid it under the mattress. She opened the window slightly, letting in the earthy scent of damp soil. The freshness of real air cleared her mind better than any pill ever could. That afternoon, a man in a white lab coat appeared, introducing himself as Dr. Thomas Hale. His voice was gentle, but his sharp eyes revealed he already knew the truth. "I've been asked to conduct a full examination of Mrs. Hensley," he said politely. Carla nodded, made a note on her clipboard, and stepped out to give them privacy. "Do you know the date and year?" today, Hale asked. "Of course," Margaret replied. "It's Friday, February 20th. And I even remember the weather. It hardly ever rains in Nevada." He smiled faintly and jotted a few notes. "Good. Do you feel you're here by choice?" "More like detained," she said calmly, "but I don't plan to stay long." Hale looked up, studying her. "You're very clear-headed. I understand now why some people would rather keep you quiet." As he prepared to leave, he leaned closer and said softly, "I'll send the report to Mr. Vega tonight. Stay strong, Mrs. Hensley." Margaret stood still for a long time, feeling her heartbeat echo like a distant drum. When Carla returned, she pretended to be tired and lay down. In the fading golden light of evening, Carla's voice softened. "Is there anything I can do for you?" "Yes," Margaret murmured, her eyes half closed. "If someone comes looking for me tomorrow, don't ask questions. Just say I'm in the reading room." Carla looked puzzled, then nodded slowly. "I understand." That night, Doris slipped in quietly with 2 cups of tea. They sat by the window, listening to the raindrops. "You have a plan, don't you?" Doris whispered. Margaret smiled, her eyes bright in the dim light. "Yes. But it's not just for me. It's for everyone who's ever had their name taken away." Doris nodded, raising her cup in silent toast. "Then I hope you win." When Doris was asleep, Margaret began to write. Day 6. Dr. Hale came. "Andrew is moving forward with the appeal. I can feel something new in the air, the scent of freedom. They think locking me away was the end, but they don't know that within these walls an escape has already begun." She closed the notebook and looked up at the night sky. The rain had stopped leaving, only the faint shimmer of moonlight reflected in puddles outside. In that reflection, she saw herself aged, but her eyes still sharp like an unblunted blade, and she knew that tomorrow everything would change. The next morning, Desert Clinic felt different. The atmosphere had changed so quiet it was almost unnatural. The nurses who walked down the hall spoke in hushed tones, avoiding Margaret's eyes. Rumors spread quickly an internal inspection team was coming. Margaret knew it was Andrew's signal. She sat in the reading room, a small space with 2 old bookshelves and a worn wooden table. Outside, sunlight streamed through the barred window, casting long golden stripes across the floor. She opened her journal and wrote a few brief lines to steady herself. Day 7. No one pays attention to me anymore. When they believe you're harmless, they turn their backs, and that's when you're free. At 10 o'clock, Carla entered quietly and whispered, "Someone's asking for you. A man in a suit. Says he's a distant relative." Margaret nodded calmly. "I'll be right there." She straightened her gray sweater and walked slowly down the hall. At the far end, Andrew Vega stood by the reception desk, holding a folder. Dressed in a light blue suit and a sand-colored tie, he looked more like an office worker than a lawyer. When their eyes met, he gave only a slight nod, no words, no gesture. "Good morning, Mrs. Hensley," he said softly. "I'm here to finalize a few small documents. It won't take long." Carla smiled, unsuspecting. 5 minutes only, okay?" Margaret followed him into a small side room. The door closed behind them. Andrew set the file on the table, his tone low and steady. "The court has received your appeal. Dr. Hale's psychological report was perfect. They've scheduled a hearing in 3 days, but there's something else your son has already filed to sell the house." Margaret closed her eyes and took a slow breath. I knew he wouldn't wait. "Don't worry," Andrew said. "I filed an injunction. The property is frozen until the case is resolved." She lifted her gaze, her eyes shining with quiet resolve. "You've done more than I ever expected." Andrew shook his head gently. "No, you've done it all yourself. I only carry your voice beyond these walls." They signed the documents quickly, and he left. The door closed so softly that Carla didn't even notice. Margaret looked around, and for a moment the small room seemed larger, as if the walls themselves had shifted outward. That afternoon, Doris came rushing in, her voice trembling with curiosity. "What's going on?" everyone's whispering. "I heard them mention your name in the office." Margaret took her friend's hand gently. "It's just an old matter finally seeing daylight. I can't tell you everything yet, but I promise when I leave this place, you'll have help too." Doris studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "I won't ask questions. I trust you." When night fell, Margaret sat by the window watching the scattered stars over the desert sky. There was no fear left in her, only the calm patience of someone who knew she had placed her final piece exactly where it needed to be. She opened her journal and wrote, "Day 7. The game has begun. They think I'm a pawn, but I know that with one more move, the king will fall." Sunday morning, sunlight blazed against the white walls of Desert Clinic, so bright it hurt the eyes. Margaret woke early, sensing a shift in the air, a quiet tension she could feel in the nurses' cautious glances and the hushed phone calls at the reception desk. She knew Ryan had found out. Near noon, the screech of tires echoed outside the main gate. The glass doors opened and Ryan and Chloe stepped in. Both were dressed neatly, as if attending a business meeting rather than visiting a mother. Carla entered Margaret's room and said softly, "You have visitors." Margaret adjusted her sweater, her voice calm. "I suppose they didn't need an appointment." When Ryan entered, his smile was forced, his eyes sharp with suspicion. "You look better, Mom," he said. "We heard someone's been coming to see you." "Who was it?" Margaret sat down and quietly poured tea. "A lawyer. They said the clinic offers free legal assistance programs. You should know people my age sometimes have questions about rights." Chloe exchanged a quick look with Ryan. "A lawyer? Why would you need a lawyer? I thought you were being well taken care of." Margaret smiled a calm, knowing smile that made Chloe falter. "So well taken care of that I'm not allowed to make phone calls, not allowed to hold my own wallet, and was made to sign documents I didn't understand. Maybe that's exactly why I need a lawyer." Ryan leaned forward, his hand pressing against the table, trying to control himself. "You're misunderstanding. We're only trying to help. You're safer here. There's proper care." "Safe," Margaret interrupted, her tone cutting like glass. "You call this safety, locking me behind white walls, taking away my voice. You once promised to protect me, Ryan. But instead, you've caged me somewhere. Even my breath sounds like it's trapped behind bars." The room went still. Chloe opened her mouth, but Ryan lifted his hand to stop her. He inhaled deeply, trying to steady his voice. "Mom, I just need to know one thing. Did you sign anything recently? Did someone take advantage of you?" Margaret looked straight into his eyes, her gaze unwavering, so firm that Ryan unconsciously leaned back. "No one took advantage of me, Ryan. Only one person ever did, and I'm fixing that mistake." Silence thickened. The ticking clock on the wall filled the space, sharp as a pin. Finally, Chloe spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "We should go. The atmosphere here isn't good for anyone." Margaret lifted her teacup, her voice calm but deliberate. "Before you leave, you should know something. The house in Reno hasn't sold yet, perhaps because it still belongs to me." Ryan's head snapped up, his face pale. How do you know that I know more than you think, Ryan? And I also know that the law doesn't only belong to the young. He stood abruptly, struggling to regain composure. You're being manipulated. I'll handle this. Yes, Margaret said softly, her tone like falling sand. You should handle it. Start by looking in the mirror. As they left, Carla passed by and saw Margaret still sitting there, her hands resting calmly on her knees. Your family came. You must be happy, she said kindly. Yes, Margaret replied softly, her gaze fixed on the window. Sometimes to truly see a person's heart, you need light as harsh as today's. That evening, she wrote in her journal, Day 8. Ryan came. He doesn't know that everything has already begun to slip out of his hands. I don't need to shout to reclaim my freedom. I only need to let the truth speak for itself. She set her pen down and closed the notebook, looking out at the dark sky beyond the window. The stars were scattered sparsely across the vast blackness, like punctuation marks in a story not yet finished, and she knew the next chapter would be the moment when the wind began to change. 3 days after that visit, Desert Clinic was on edge. The staff spoke in whispers, the administrators appeared more often, and Carla began avoiding Margaret's gaze as if afraid of being caught up in something she shouldn't. Margaret understood Ryan had called. That afternoon, Andrew arrived dressed in a beige suit, posing as an employee from the Department of Senior Welfare. He calmly signed the visitor's log, a folder tucked under his arm. Carla glanced briefly at him, then smiled and let him pass without question. Margaret was already waiting in the common room near the half-open window. Andrew approached, speaking just loud enough for her to hear. The court has set the hearing date. Wednesday morning. You'll be escorted there as both witness and plaintiff. The appeal has been preliminarily approved. Margaret lifted her head, her eyes brightening. Good. But does Ryan know? Not yet, Andrew replied. He'll find out through his lawyer when the summons is delivered tomorrow morning. He opened his briefcase and handed her a small envelope. Inside are the official documents for the account. Everything has been transferred to the Clara West Trust. The main account can only be accessed with your identification code. Margaret brushed her fingers over the envelope, feeling as if she were holding an entirely new life. I want to transfer part of it to Ella, but only once I officially regain my legal rights. Andrew nodded. I've already drafted the paperwork. After the hearing, we'll make it public. Outside, the loudspeaker announced dinner time. They exchanged a look, both knowing they needed to end the conversation quickly. Before leaving, Andrew said quietly, "Stay silent. Don't argue with anyone, not even your son. Let the law speak for you." Margaret nodded, holding the envelope close to her chest. I've been silent long enough to understand the value of speaking at the right moment. That night, after the hallway lights dimmed, Carla unexpectedly knocked on Margaret's door. She entered, her face tense and uncertain. "Are you in some kind of trouble? Mr. Vega came today, and I heard your name mentioned in the office. They said you're going to court." Margaret smiled gently. "No trouble, Carla. I'm just going home." Carla froze. "They're letting you go?" "No one's letting me. I'm deciding for myself." The answer left the young nurse speechless for a moment. Then she nodded, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. "I hope that's true. If you leave, I'll miss you." "And I'll miss you too," Margaret said softly. "Thank you for never treating me like a shadow." When Carla left, Doris appeared at the door, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "I heard you're leaving this place," she said. Margaret turned toward her with a faint, wistful smile. "Not leaving, escaping." Doris sat beside her, placing a hand over hers. "When you get out, live loud enough for those of us who stay. I promise," Margaret whispered, her eyes shimmering. "And I'll leave something for you, too, a small path toward freedom." That night, she opened her journal and wrote, Day 9. Everything is in place. Andrew says the law is on my side, but I know real justice lies in persistence. They were wrong to think age was a limit. I am only old in years, not in mind. Outside, the desert wind howled through the corridors. Margaret stood by the window, gazing into the distance. Along the highway, car lights stretched in a long, glowing line, like fireflies searching for a way through the night. She whispered, Just 3 more days and I'll walk again without asking permission. Then she closed the journal and tucked the envelope beneath her pillow. In that silence, she knew the final confrontation had begun, not with shouting, but with the calm resolve of someone fully ready to take everything back. Wednesday morning, the Nevada sky was startlingly clear. Cool air drifted through the iron window frame, carrying with it the scent of desert dust and fresh sunlight. Margaret was already sitting on the edge of her bed, her gray coat folded neatly beside her. When the door opened, 2 court escorts stepped in, holding a paper stamped with the red seal of the court. Mrs. Hensley, it's time. She stood up, her voice calm. I know. I've been waiting for this day for a long time. Before leaving the room, she looked down the hallway where Doris stood at the far end. The older woman raised her hand slightly, and Margaret smiled back. No words were needed. In that single glance, both women understood this was not just a hearing. It was the day she reclaimed herself. The black car rolled away from Desert Clinic. Through the window, the desert stretched endlessly, wind swirling sand like smoke. Andrew sat in the front seat and turned to her. The court will ask a few basic questions. You just need to tell the truth. I have all the evidence prepared. Margaret nodded gently. The truth is, the one thing they could never take from me. The courtroom was small and plain. White light streamed through the window, washing over the worn wooden panels. On the other side, Ryan sat beside his lawyer, his hands clenched tightly. When he saw his mother enter, he jumped to his feet, his voice shaking. Mom. She glanced at him once but said nothing. The judge, a composed middle-aged woman with steady eyes, tapped her gavel lightly. The hearing between Mrs. Margaret Hensley and Mr. Ryan Hensley will now begin. Andrew stood his tone low and firm. Your Honor, my client was placed in a nursing facility against her will. All authorization forms were signed without her consent or legal certification. During her time there, she was denied access to her personal assets, isolated and restricted from communication. Ryan's lawyer countered immediately. My client acted out of love. Every decision was made to protect his mother's health and well-being. The judge turned to Margaret. Mrs. Hensley, would you like to speak? Margaret rose, her voice quiet but unwavering. I have lived 68 years, and I know the difference between care and control. My son did not protect me, he imprisoned me. I never signed any document. I was taken away like an object stripped of the right to speak, to live in my own home. The room fell silent. Only the sound of the clerk's pen, scratching across paper, broke the stillness. The judge asked, Do you have proof of your mental competence? Andrew handed over a medical report. This is an independent evaluation by Dr. Hale. It confirms Mrs. Hensley is completely lucid with no signs of cognitive or psychological impairment. The judge read the report carefully, her expression hardening. Mr. Hensley, do you have a response? Ryan lowered his head. I was just afraid she would forget. I was afraid she'd be in danger alone. Margaret looked at him, her eyes sorrowful but calm. No, Ryan, you weren't afraid I'd forget. You were afraid of losing control. You used love as an excuse to keep me like something you owned. The air in the room grew heavy, tense. The judge set down her pen and spoke clearly. After reviewing the evidence, the court revokes the guardianship of Mr. Ryan Hensley. Mrs. Margaret Hensley is fully reinstated with complete control over her assets and personal autonomy. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, sharp and final like a key, turning in a long, locked door. Ryan looked up, his face pale. "Mom, what will you do to me?" Margaret answered slowly, each word deliberate. "Nothing. You've already lost more than anyone could ever take from you." She turned away as Andrew gathered the files and followed her. When they stepped outside, the desert wind swept in spinning golden dust into the air. Margaret tilted her head back and inhaled deeply. The air was dry and rough, but it tasted like freedom. On the drive back, Andrew spoke quietly. "I'll begin transferring ownership of the house and the trust. Everything will be settled soon." Margaret looked out the window, sunlight glimmering in her eyes. "You know, Andrew, a house isn't just a place to live. It's where a person is called by their real name." He smiled softly, saying nothing. As the car wound through the distant hills, Margaret opened her worn journal and wrote in slow, steady strokes, Day 10. "I heard my name again in that courtroom. The sound of the gavel was the sound of my heart beating again. I have won not through anger but through truth. There is no greater victory than reclaiming one's dignity." The car continued down the long, golden road. Margaret closed her eyes and leaned her head against the seat. In her brief dream, she was walking across the vast desert, no fences, no locked doors, only wind sunlight and a road leading straight toward freedom. That morning, the Reno sky was crystal clear after a night of rain. Sunlight poured into the small house, shining over the lavender garden that had begun to bloom again. Margaret sat at the wooden table, holding a warm cup of tea, her eyes gazing out the porch. Steam rose slowly, like a thin wisp of smoke. Peaceful, simple, real. For the first time in months, she felt that life had finally found its rhythm again. A knock echoed on the door. Ella entered, her arms full of papers and a small camera. "Grandma, I brought the design for the Clara West Scholarship logo. I think you'll love it." Margaret looked at her granddaughter, the corners of her lips lifting. "You're fast. I'm still not used to having a scholarship fund with my name on it." Ella smiled. "It's not just yours. It belongs to everyone who was ever silenced. You gave them hope." Margaret took a sip of tea and said softly, "I didn't save anyone, Ella. I just stood up to save myself. But if that made others want to do the same, then that's the greatest gift of all." They stepped out to the porch. Sunlight touched Margaret's silver hair, making it gleam like threads of light. Ella placed the camera on the table and adjusted the frame. "I want to record another video. The last one went viral, over 1 million views now. I know. People wrote to me so many letters. Some said their children abandoned them. Others are still living in care homes. Reading them makes my heart feel heavy." Then today, Ella said gently, "Say something for them." Margaret nodded, took a deep breath, and looked straight into the lens. "I once thought my time had passed. That old age was the end of every dream. But it wasn't. I was only made to believe that. And if you're hearing this, remember you still have the right to begin again. No matter how old you are, you still have a voice, you still have choices." Ella stopped recording. For a few moments they sat in silence, listening to the wind whisper through the fence. Then the young woman smiled. "You always know how to make people believe in something good." Margaret smiled back, her tone warm and steady. "Because I once forgot how. And when you've forgotten, you learn how to speak so others can remember." That afternoon, Andrew arrived with the final stack of documents. "I came to deliver the official news," he said. "Everything is complete. The house, the assets, the foundation, it's all yours. No one can interfere anymore." Margaret stood taking his hand. "Thank you, Andrew. Not just for the work, but for believing in me when no one else did. He smiled softly. Believing in you wasn't hard. From the first moment we met, I knew I was speaking to someone ready to fight. She just needed a path. There's always a path, Margaret replied. Sometimes we just need someone to light it. When he left, the house returned to calm. Margaret opened her journal and wrote a few lines. Day 12. At last, everything is where it belongs. I no longer feel anger or fear or the need to prove anything. I only feel gratitude for every loss that brought me back to myself. That evening, she and Ella had dinner on the porch. The soft glow of a lamp, the hum of crickets, the warmth of shared silence. Ella said, "Grandma." I read a new comment today. Someone wrote, "Because of you, I called my mother after 10 years. Margaret smiled faintly. Just one phone call, but it can change a lifetime. Maybe that's enough. I think you should end every video with something like that, a line that makes people want to act. Like if you've heard my story, tell your part of it." Margaret nodded. That's good. Simple and true. Late that night, after Ella had gone to bed, Margaret sat alone, opening her worn leather notebook. She turned through its pages from the shaky words written inside Desert Clinic to the firm, steady lines of the present. Each sentence was a scar, but also proof that she had never stopped fighting. She added the final entry, Day 12. I've left the place that once confined me. But more importantly, I've left the fear inside me. Someone once said, freedom comes when you no longer need to prove yourself. I believe freedom begins when you can speak the truth without trembling. She closed the book and looked out to the garden. The full moon bathed the lavender in silver light, the air rich with its fragrance. The window was slightly open and Ella's voice floated from the kitchen. "Grandma, I made tea." Margaret smiled. "I'm coming." She stepped through the doorway where warm light spilled from the kitchen. The years of confinement, neglect, and silence now felt like a distant dream. Ahead of her was a new morning, and the woman who had once been locked away was now a voice for thousands. Before turning off the light, she said softly to Ella, "If someone hears my story, remind them, share it. Comment, speak up. Every voice deserves to be heard, no matter how small." Then Margaret gently closed the door. The nightlight faded, leaving only the scent of tea, the fragrance of flowers, and the peaceful breathing of a woman who had finally found true freedom. Saturday morning sunlight streamed through the living room window, touching Margaret's hand as she held a cup of tea. On the table lay a stack of open letters, most of them filled with words of gratitude, a few bearing the name Clara West Scholarship Foundation. News of her court case had spread not through the press, but through word of mouth. People spoke of the woman in Nevada who won back her freedom from her own son. Margaret neither confirmed nor denied it. She simply smiled. The truth did not always need to be spoken. Sometimes it only needed to be lived. The wooden door creaked open. Ella stepped in, carrying the scent of youth and a bright smile. "Grandma," she cried, rushing forward to embrace her. "I still can't believe you're really back here." Margaret smiled, wrapping her arms around her granddaughter. "Neither can I. There were times I thought I'd never see this house again." Ella glanced around, her eyes shimmering. "It's still beautiful, just a little sad. But I'll help you fix it. We'll rebuild the lavender garden, right? Yes." Margaret whispered, her voice catching slightly. "And this time, it'll be planted with freedom." At noon, they ate lunch together on the porch. Ella talked about college, her friends, and an art project she was working on. She spoke of how she was using the scholarship fund to help older women who had been forced to sell their homes or lost their assets. Grandma, there are so many women who've been deceived by their own children just like you. But because of your story, they're reaching out to lawyers. You've helped more people than you realize." Margaret stayed silent for a moment. A single tear dropped into her cup of tea. "I never meant to be a hero, Ella. I just didn't want to die in silence." "And that's exactly why you became one," Ella said softly. That afternoon, they cleaned out David's old study. In the desk drawer, Margaret found a small wooden box. Inside was the fountain pen he used to write with and a folded, yellowed piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully. David's handwriting appeared clear and deliberate. "If you're reading this, it means you found your way home. Don't be afraid of growing old. Don't be afraid of being alone. Remember, people only truly die when they stop believing they can still do something good." Margaret closed the letter and pressed it to her chest. Ella sat beside her silent. 2 generations one who had endured the other just beginning. Margaret whispered, "Sometimes freedom isn't about leaving. It's about staying and rebuilding everything with your own hands." That evening, Andrew stopped by with a few final documents. "I won't stay long," he said. "Just some good news. The Clara West Trust is now officially active. Your name has been removed from all guardianship records, and Ryan has withdrawn his appeal." Margaret looked up. "Withdrawn?" "Yes. I think he realized there's nothing left to fight for. I heard he and his wife moved out of Reno." She nodded slowly. "I never wanted them to suffer. I just wanted them to learn where greed ends." Andrew smiled gently. "Sometimes losing is the only way to learn." He turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "Have you ever thought about writing your story? It deserves to be told." Margaret gazed toward the dark garden outside where a golden light shone over the young lavender shoots. "I'm already writing it. Not for the world, but to remind myself that no age is too late to start over." After Andrew left, the house grew quiet again. Ella brewed tea and brought it to the porch. "Grandma, I made you a YouTube account," she said excitedly. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "YouTube, yes. I'll record you telling stories not for money, but to keep your voice alive. People need to hear you." Margaret chuckled, her eyes glinting with rare mischief. "So you want me to become an internet storyteller? You'll be a real storyteller, Grandma, for those who are still silent." That night, they filmed the first video. The setting was simple. Margaret sitting on the porch, the lavender garden, and a soft red sunset behind her. Ella asked Grandma if you could speak to people who feel forgotten. What would you say? Margaret looked straight into the camera, her voice slow, steady, and full of emotion. "I was once left behind. I was once called useless, a burden. But I want to tell you, you still have worth. They can take your house, your money, but no one can take your dignity. Don't stay silent. Stand up even once for yourself." Behind the camera, Ella stayed quiet. There was a long pause filled only by the sound of crickets outside. Finally, she whispered, "That was perfect, Grandma." 3 weeks later, the video went viral. No ads, no fancy music, just a steady voice and clear eyes shining through the dark. Hundreds of comments poured in. "You made me cry. I'm calling my mother right now. Thank you for reminding me it's not too late." Late one night, Margaret read the comments one by one, her hands trembling but a smile on her lips. She replied to them all with just one line. "If my story makes you want to live differently, keep telling you're part of it." Then she closed the laptop and stepped out onto the porch. The night breeze carried the scent of lavender and the distant sound of waves. In that stillness, she felt David beside her, Ella asleep in the next room, and the past finally at peace. She opened her journal and wrote the final page, Day 12. No more fear, no more debts to the past. I've walked through the storm and learned this. Sometimes freedom begins only when you stop running from yourself. If you're reading these words, remember you were never a burden. You are a story the world still needs to hear. She set the pen down, took a deep breath, and looked toward the dawn, breaking on the horizon. The sky burned orange, and from inside the house came Ella's voice, "Grandma, I made tea." Margaret smiled softly. "I'm coming." She stood stepping through the doorway as sunlight filled the room, and with each step, the shadows behind her began to fade. The woman who had once been confined now walked into a new morning where freedom was no longer a dream, but a reality in every breath she took. And if someone hears this story, Margaret hopes they do one simple thing: share it, comment, and tell your own story. Because every word, no matter how small, has the power to unlock another life.